By 1942, the world was at war. Little did we know that this was to become the bloodiest and most costly conflict in human history. The world became divided into two main factions: the Allied powers and the Axis powers. The three main Allied powers were the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, the United States, whose president was Franklin Roosevelt, and the United Kingdom, whose prime minister was Winston Churchill. Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler. Fascist Italy, led by Benito Mussolini. And Imperial Japan, led by Emperor Hirohito, were the three main Axis powers. The Aleutian Islands are a chain of U.S.-controlled islands off the coast of Alaska. On June 3, 1942, the Aleutian Islands campaign began. This is undoubtedly one of the most important U.S. encounters with Japan throughout the war. When the Aleutian Islands campaign began, Japan was a very great military threat to the U.S. The attack on Pearl Harbor had already occurred, and we had already fought a few battles with Japan. The Japanese attack on the Aleutian Islands began on the same day as the Battle of Midway. Some historians suspect that the attack on the Aleutian Islands was a diversion plan masterminded by the Japanese to take control of the strategic Midway Atoll. The Japanese began bombing Dutch Harbor on the 3rd of June, a U.S. harbor on Kodiak Island. The man who was put in charge of overseeing the U.S. campaign in the Aleutian Islands was Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid. He remained in charge throughout the entire campaign. After Dutch Harbor, the Japanese invasion spread like wildfire. They quickly took the majority of the Komandorski Islands. Throughout the rest of 1942, the United States took no major military action besides scouting and spying missions on the problem of the Japanese-controlled Aleutian Islands. What you are about to see is informational historical footage on the island of Adak and a bombing mission on Kiska.
Is measureless. Strategically, Adak is one of the most important locations in the world. 11 days after the occupation, an airfield was completed, and the first U.S. bomber sat down. 3 days later, flights took off on a bombing mission to Kiska, with complete fighter protection. Since that time, missions over Kiska have become a daily affair. The airfield is the heart of the island, beating with 500,000 horsepower of heavy and medium bombers, Navy amphibians, pursuit ships, transports. The sound of the engines warming up starts before dawn, echoing back from the mountains that flank the field. Every day, weather permitting, the bombers take off on at least one mission.
The Japanese established their main bases on the islands of Attu and Kiska, with the latter being the main concentration of Japanese military activity. The U.S. came up with tons of propaganda on the Aleutian Islands because, after all, it was one of only 2 attacks on U.S. soil throughout World War II. The video you are about to see is a historical U.S. military propaganda video on the Aleutian Islands campaign released to the public eye.
The Aleutian Islands are situated in the North Pacific Ocean, forming a chain which extends about 1,200 miles west-southwest from Alaska Peninsula toward Siberia to form the southern boundary of the Bering Sea. The Aleutians comprise 4 groups, the Fox, Andreanof, Rat, and Near Islands, and constitute part of the territory of Alaska, USA. Of volcanic origin, there are numerous cones on the chain, many of them still active. The coasts are rocky and surf-worn, rising immediately from the water in steep, bold mountains. The Aleutians are the storm pot of the Western world. A permanent low-pressure area prevails there. Cold air masses from the polar regions flow with a shearing effect against the warm, moisture-laden air masses over the Japanese current to form cyclonic disturbances.
By May 11, 1943, the United States began its operation to reclaim Attu Island. The plan was to capture Attu and then move from there to the more heavily defended Kiska Island. When U.S. troops first began landing on Attu, they met no resistance from the Japanese. The main reason for that was because the Japanese entrenched themselves farther inland, which resulted in extremely fierce combat later on. The farther the American troops trekked inland, the worse the combat became. The fighting lasted throughout May and June of 1943. As the fighting dragged on, the Japanese realized they were losing the island. As a result, they reverted to a suicidal method of fighting known as a banzai charge. A banzai charge is a historical Japanese suicide attack. It goes off of their traditional belief that a soldier is dishonored if he surrenders or is captured. These attacks are essentially hordes of Japanese troops charging their enemy with bayonets or katanas, and with complete disregard to their own lives, expecting to die. The commander of the Japanese base on Attu, Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, saw that the island was going to be taken by the enemy, so he ordered all of his remaining units to undergo a final massive banzai charge, with himself leading the attack. The attack broke through the front lines of the American soldiers with shocking ferocity. Brutal hand-to-hand combat ensued, and hundreds of Americans were killed. However, this was nothing compared to the Japanese, who suffered over 2,000 casualties. This was the second largest banzai charge in World War II, surpassed only by the one that occurred during the Battle of Saipan. The attack resulted in the deaths of nearly all of Colonel Yamasaki's troops. Yamasaki himself was killed by American machine gun fire near a place called Engineer Hill. On August 15, 1943, about 34,500 American and Canadian troops landed on Kiska Island, expecting resistance even larger than what was experienced on Attu. Little did they know that the Japanese defenders had abandoned the base 2 weeks prior. Although the base had been evacuated, 314 soldiers still died because of disease, frostbite, friendly fire, and booby traps left by the Japanese. On July 28, 1943, the U.S. Navy officially withdrew from the island of Kiska, which successfully ended the Aleutian Islands campaign. The results of this campaign were significant. One result of the Aleutian Islands campaign was the Alaskan Highway. It was constructed partially due to the fact that U.S. troops needed weapons and supplies in their fight against the Japanese. With this U.S. victory over Japan in the Aleutian Islands, U.S. morale increased significantly, which led to the victory in Europe, and ultimately, the United States victory over Japan in the Second World War.